Hey everybody, welcome to another episode. My name is Jared Boland here with Man Up Ministry Online. Today we're going to be taking a look back in Genesis again, and today I want to answer the question, or at least talk about the question of where in the world is the Garden of Eden? We talk about it and we hear about it briefly in Genesis chapter 2 and 3 for that matter. They're right there at the beginning of the book of Genesis. But the irony and the big question is we have this fantastic origin story, this great historical account, and there's some decent details about where the garden was located, and yet this is a much debated, probably highly controversial topic about where exactly was the Garden of Eden located. So today I want to kind of walk through some things I learned. I read the story last night, spent, a fair amount of time doing some research and just trying to answer my own questions that were popping up along the way. And so I'm coming to you to kind of walk through that process and talk about where we think the Garden of Eden might actually have been located. So before we jump in, huge disclaimer, I am not a scholar and I'm not going to pretend or claim to know all of the answers or to know the exact location of anything. But I think it's exciting and fun to explore the Bible and chew it up and share a little bit about the things that I learned while I did a little bit of my own research as well, and hopefully you find it interesting too. So let's jump in. So first off, I want to start with probably just talking about what do we know? What do we know about the Garden of Eden as it is described in the book of Genesis? Point number one comes out of Genesis 2, verse 8, and it says, "The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man who he had formed." So point number one is simply this, that it was planted in the east. Now that doesn't feel super helpful right off the bat, but I guess I want to start by saying that there is an east worth looking into when you think of it from a regional context, especially from the writer. We all understand that Genesis wasn't written by Adam, that realistically there was a lot of oral history telling throughout much of time, and that the first several books of the Bible were actually written during Moses' time. So regionally speaking, we can look at the world as they lived in it and understand that the East to the people at that time probably would have meant the eastern part of what we call here in America the Middle East, looking in the regions of eastern Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. So looking at it from that context, we already start to hone in a little bit on where the most likely location of the Garden of Eden probably was, maybe within the modern day geography of one of those three countries. Next, I think it's important to note that we know that the garden was maybe not what we would consider to be a standard garden, especially here in the United States, but was probably more likely an orchard, as we would describe them. And it's described as having every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. So God had planted this oasis on the earth, this area of land that specifically had every good tree that was both appealing by sight, but also produced what would have been delicious and probably nutritiously beneficial fruit for Adam to garden and work. And we'll get into that in another video, but it was important to understand that this land was filled with plants that would thrive based on Adam fulfilling his role as the gardener. that he would take care of the land and do what was necessary for these plants to thrive. But God kickstarted it by putting the best of the best all in this, what I'll call an orchard. 3, we know that there were 2 extra trees or plants, very specific to that area. We don't hear them mentioned in any other part of the earth throughout the rest of the biblical account, and that is 1, the tree of life, which we don't know a lot about, although it's hinted at both in Genesis as well as later on more talking about kind of the restoration of earth. And we understand that the tree of life essentially helped to grant immortality. We don't know exactly how this works, or at least my understanding is that we don't know exactly how this works because we have mostly a understanding of sin's effect on humanity, which naturally brought death. So I don't know if the tree was going to be necessary, the fruit of that tree was going to be necessary to live forever, or if that was kind of already part of the deal. But regardless, we understand that the tree of life was in that garden, and that was one of the reasons that Adam and Eve, after having committed sin and the fall happened, that God removed them and banished them from the garden in order to prevent them from living forever with sin. That since they were now broken and in this kind of busted state, for lack of better words, that God didn't want them also getting a hold of the tree of life and extending that corruption. We also understand, as part of the same story I was just hinting at, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was also planted specifically in the Garden of Eden. And as we find out, and we'll talk about in another episode, this particular tree had fruit that gave whoever ate of it, whoever ate of the fruit, essentially the wisdom of God. This is why when they ate of it, Adam and Eve became immediately aware that they were naked, for instance. They had no reason to think about the fact that they were naked. They had no reason to feel shame about that fact. Essentially, they were, hate to use the term enlightened, but they were granted a window into God's wisdom when they ate the fruit, which sounds good, right? Like, sounds like a positive thing. It wasn't that the fruit is what killed them. It wasn't that the fruit somehow poisoned them or gave them the sin. The sin was the disobedience of eating of it, even though God said not to. And that's important to remember as you think about that story. That sin didn't come from the fruit. The tree was a good thing. In fact, the tree, its fruit, gave this gift of increased wisdom, essentially. The issue was how they went about it. And they sinned and fell because they did so in secret and in opposition to God's commands. Nevertheless, some of the things we know about the Garden of Eden include that. And lastly, and I think this is important because we're going to talk about this very fact, is that we know that as it's described, in fact, let me read it for you really quick. Genesis 2:10 states that a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. And there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the world, flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stones are also there. And just so you know, I mean, obviously we all know what gold is, so there was plentiful and good gold in that land. Bdellium is kind of considered a precious stone, but it is pearl-like, not pearls like we understand from oysters, I believe it is, that make pearls, but rather it is a hardened form of tree sap that had a pearl-like state about it, and it was a prized thing, and it was a sign of healthy land and growth. And onyx is some of us are aware, a precious stone as well. So the first river flowed through Havilah, where all of these materials were located. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. So we kind of get an idea even more focused in on where Eden may have been, because we understand that there is supposed to be this junction right there, right outside of Eden, where these four rivers divide or converge, however you want to look at it. And so we start to get this idea about where Eden may have been located, because at the very least, and we're going to talk more about this today, we know exactly where the Tigris and the Euphrates are. Now, switching gears a little bit, that is what we know about the Garden of Eden according to Genesis. That being said, there are some issues that make pinpointing Eden hard to do. And so I want to talk about some of those. This is where some of the controversy and confusion sets in, is because there are things that made it difficult one way or the other to really be certain about where this place might have been located. The first issue that comes up is that really nobody references Eden after the banishment. By banishment, I mean Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. At that point on, they're not allowed to return. When you read the story, you understand that there's essentially both a barrier and a guard involved in the form of a flaming sword, among other things. Needless to say, Eden existed, but man was not allowed in. And that's how it stayed for a period of time. Like I said, we don't hear a lot about the Garden of Eden, which is problematic because we don't hear a lot about where it was located in the historical record that is the Bible. So that naturally begins to complicate the search. The second issue we see is that, as I mentioned, two of the rivers are well known, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. You can look them up on a map. In fact, let me put this picture up right now. Now, as you can see, the Tigris River starts somewhere around central or eastern Turkey and flows southeast through Iraq until it gets near the Persian Gulf. And likewise, the Euphrates River also starts in Turkey, flows through Syria, and continues southeast through Iraq, kind of running parallel to the Tigris River until it also gets near the Persian Gulf. And there is a convergence of the two rivers there. Now, here's the big issue. We have this very obvious, mapped out, known two rivers. We understand that there's supposed to be a convergence of four rivers, one place or the other, in regards to the four rivers mentioned. But that being said, there is an obvious convergence in the south and just a proximity in the north of the two rivers that we know by name today. But on the flip side, the Pishon and the Gihon rivers either do not exist today or have changed names at some point in history, to the point that nobody has used those names in so long that nobody actually knows where they were referenced from or at what point the name would have changed. I have not found any reasonable information at this point to suggest that people actually know where those rivers are or were, and therefore we have this blank spot, this hole in the story or in the investigation about where Eden might have been situated. In addition to that issue, we hear reference of two different lands that those two specific rivers that are unknown flowed through. So you have this glimmer of hope thinking, oh, well, we may not be able to locate the rivers, but surely we can locate the lands they're talking about. This becomes further problematic. The two lands that are referenced here, being Havilah and Cush, also don't have definitively agreed upon locations between the historical record and the Bible and so forth. There are lands that were referred to as Havilah and Cush. One study that I had run into and kind of rabbit hole I had gone down referenced two lands both named after those in northern Africa. But naturally that's problematic because even the Nile, for instance, being the main river that would have flown through that land, wouldn't likely have had a junction with the other two rivers that would have made sense, especially based on flow. In fact, they flow in opposite directions, and that's pretty problematic in and of itself. So, because we don't actually know where the land of Havilah or Cush were in regards to how they're mentioned in the account of the Garden of Eden, again, we have these details that should be super helpful in the historical record, in the book of Genesis, that should have pointed us in the right direction, and instead kind of leave us walking up to a hole in the story. That being said, despite those issues or holes that are leaving many versions or theories contested, I think there are some things worth looking at that kind of point us in the right direction. And then there are some things, especially in the Christian historical accounts, agreed upon historical accounts of Judeo-Christian beliefs, that explain how we have these gaps to begin with, and how we have to practice some humility in how we look at these things. So the first is that one theory suggests that the Garden of Eden was located essentially near the convergence of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers near the Persian Gulf there in the Middle East. And here, I'll show you this picture really quick and kind of talk through it. So here you can see, as we track both the Tigris River and the Euphrates River downstream in their flow toward the Persian Gulf, we see a natural convergence take place at the southeast part of Iraq near the Iranian border. And the interesting thing about this location, and probably why this is a popular theory, is that there are other rivers that also seem to converge upon this point, and leaving people naturally assuming that possibly this is where the Garden of Eden was located before it was likely destroyed. I've actually even heard accounts discussing that the Garden of Eden may even be, or have been, originally located up in that northernmost point of the Persian Gulf, suggesting that it was flooded during the Great Flood or other historical events as the geography of the region changed. And much like, I guess, the story of Atlantis or some other area, essentially where the garden was, eventually landed underwater. That is one popular theory. The next popular theory, which I tend to agree with, and I'll explain why, a couple of reasons why I think this is the most credible theory, just looking at the bare bones of what's described in the Bible, is that the Garden of Eden was more likely located in an area in eastern Turkey near the mouths of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And the reason that I think that that is a more reasonable idea, even though those rivers don't converge in that area any longer, is for a couple of points. The first being that even though there's no natural connection between the rivers in this part of the country, it makes the most sense from the biblical narrative because it talks about a river flowing out of Eden through the garden to water it and then dividing into 4 rivers. Now, if the Garden of Eden was located near the deltas or the convergence of the Tigris and the Euphrates, nearer to the Persian Gulf, because we understand those rivers flow southeast, that wouldn't make any sense because the rivers would not be flowing in a direction and then dividing. In fact, they flow together at that point. It makes more sense, geographically speaking, that the Garden of Eden would have been closer to where the rivers start. In today's terms, probably the current mouths of those 2 rivers probably are not the original location of the mouths. In fact, biblically speaking, they wouldn't have been. They would have all divided from one major river that divided into these 4 rivers that are talked about. The other reason that I think this is kind of a good theory to go off of, and I'm going to bring a picture back up here so we can talk about it. You'll notice that this suggested area not only makes sense from the river standpoint because the Tigris and the Euphrates do in fact come pretty close together up in this eastern area of Turkey, but if the rivers mentioned in the account of the Garden of Eden still exists today, there are some other rivers that are nearby that may make sense, including one that flows east toward the Caspian Sea, which is the northern border of Iran between Armenia. And this river, called the Araxes or the Iraks, could possibly be one of the rivers mentioned, but without jumping to that conclusion, it makes sense that this area of land near where the rivers start would have been the original convergence, or I guess divergence, where they split apart near the Garden of Eden. And the other reason I like this idea is because it is also an area of land there in eastern Turkey near Mount Ararat, which obviously becomes a huge biblical marker history point when we talk about the story of the flood in regards to Noah. Since these stories are so close together, relatively speaking, in time, and it works when you're talking about how the rivers would have been close together or tied together at that point in time. I like this idea. I think it's an interesting thing to think about the Garden of Eden not falling under kind of an Atlantis type of flood model, but rather just simply having changed over time, geographically speaking, to not be resembled today. So the last thing I want to talk about as I kind of bring this discussion to a close is what major barriers historically would have aided in disguising the land or changing the land so that the Garden of Eden would have been destroyed or wiped away, and we wouldn't be able to just readily acknowledge it today. Obviously, a lot of non-believers or even atheists who look at that literal model would probably be saying, well, the garden doesn't exist. There's no place with these natural barriers. There's no flaming sword floating around or this or that. But the reality is there are some major events, even just in Genesis, that would help to explain how the garden was removed by God. And so we look at one, just the sheer issue of time and how time has an effect on land structures, on climates, on geography, and so forth. Even just talking about it from a historical narrative perspective, what might have happened over these thousands of years to both make the land shift, but also the story and the accounts shift over time. A major event that took place, which could have easily resolved the issue of wiping it off the map, was of course the flood. We understand that the entire surface of the world was completely inundated with water, completely covered up. The ark is the only thing that held living creatures that repopulated the earth. And so as we understand it, if something like that happened to the planet, it could have easily wiped off and erased whatever was growing or existing at that point in time. Obviously, God could have removed his graces from that land at that point as well, especially since he was kind of pressing the reset button. And so it makes sense that the flood in and of itself would have created this disappearance of such a blessed and mysterious piece of land. The third thing that's worth mentioning, if you follow this theory, there is actually a bridge or a crossover between the idea of a Pangea supercontinent and the Christian record. It's not talked about a lot because the Bible really isn't a science book and doesn't spend a lot of time talking about this. But there in Genesis 10:25, during one of the genealogical records, we see this note, and it's mentioned for a reason. In fact, it's such a quick genealogy, the fact that it took a moment in the record to even state, like, here's a big thing that happened. We hear this mention of Peleg, and it says, for in his days the earth was divided. And there are going theories, even within Christianity, that during Peleg's time, during his days on earth, the earth was literally divided. The supercontinent, if it were, was separated into the continents as we know them today. Now, whether that was through just major tectonic activity, earthquakes, God doing his thing in a much shorter time span than the evolutionary model might have suggested, regardless, there is a theory out there that the earth was drastically changed in that manner. And if that's the case, it would have been during Peleg's time, because there is this note about something significantly happening to the earth in those days. And lastly, one more major significant event during this time was just looking at the story of the Tower of Babel, and the fact that there was a predominance in oral history telling at this point in time, and you would have had a major scrambling of what was probably a pretty consistent historical record, all things considered. You have the scrambling of this historical record due to the confusion and dispersion of the people during this time at the Tower of Babel. And if you aren't familiar with the story, essentially they had cast God aside and were beginning to do things maybe not so much in opposition to God, but just moving on without God. And God knew where that road moved. And so it says that he dispersed the people. And the main reason, or the main way he went about doing that, was scrambling their tongues or their languages so that these different pockets of people instantly began speaking separate languages and couldn't understand each other. And so you have this moment in time where everybody went from being on the same page with each other, speaking the same language as each other, and then instantly having this mass chaos and confusion. And don't read past it too quickly. Imagine if that had happened today, even just in America, and English was split into 50 languages per se. It would have caused chaos for some time as societies regrouped and figured out how to reestablish themselves. So this could have had a massive effect on the passing along of key details that might have hinted at important areas or facts associated with the story of Genesis and certainly the story of the Garden of Eden. So maybe that's the point where names of rivers changed immediately, or names of lands changed immediately. So there is no definitive answer. Really, I just wanted to take you guys on a journey that I went on as I studied this chapter. I thought it was so interesting to dive in to just the story in Genesis 2. And I know it's kind of hyper-focused. This study is hyper-focused on what took place in those couple of paragraphs talking about where in the world is the Garden of Eden? What happened to it? Where was it located? Hopefully you enjoyed just breaking it down in this way and looking at some of the factors and the interesting things. Do some more research. It can be a lot of fun to do some digging and just see where things take you. For now, I hope you all have a great day, and I hope that you join me next time. Talk soon. Hey, thanks for taking some time out of your busy day to give our channel a listen. Hopefully you liked the video. If you did, be sure and smash this button right here so that you can get access to all the latest content by subscribing to our channel, Man Up Ministry Online. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit this button right here and check out another video before you take off.